Just in case your job sucks, let me assure you it could be worse. Throughout history, there were jobs that would make you upchuck or just drastically reduce your lifespan. Lots of crappy jobs, pun intended, but also like lime burning, leech collecting, and more. So what do you think would be the worst job you could have had in history? Let me know in the comments and let's get into some doozies. Let's start with what might be the actual crappiest one of all. Pun intended. One of the grisly jobs in history was being a groom of the stool for the King of England. Now this groom of the stool was a person responsible for cleaning the king's rear end after he went number 2. He also had the privilege of administering an enema should the king find himself constipated. Why was this a thing? Well, in the tradition of the divine right, which placed kings on the level of gods, for centuries it was thought improper for a king to wipe his own rear end. Though prestigious, this job is kind of, well, humiliating. But apparently, being a groom of the stool was immensely desired. The king chose only men whom he trusted the most to be relaxed with, well, doing his business. And besides cleaning the king's rear end, the groom of the stool would have to provide a bowl, water, and towels for the king. He also transported the king's portable toilet, or stool, wherever the king went. Also, remember, toilet paper has only existed for the last 200 years, so kings only used cloth and water to do the cleaning. Also, in many cases, being with the king during private activities, the groom of the stool was the king's closest friend and confidant. For example, the groom of the stool for Henry procured women for the king to have coitus with. Hence, the groom of the stool was the royal madam, if you will. Matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a wait a minute. This isn't the classic rhyme, rather the factories of London. Matchsticks were made by cutting wood into thin little sticks and then dipping the end into white phosphorus, which is a highly toxic chemical. In the Victorian era, this work was mainly performed by, well, younger women who worked in terrible conditions, often for between 12 to 16 hours a day with very few breaks. Maybe one. And the grossness happened after you'd been on the job for a couple of years. So if you took your break, you were forced to eat at your workstation, meaning that toxic phosphorus got into your food, leading to some folks developing the dreadful condition known as phossy jaw, where the jawbone becomes infected, leading to severe disfigurement. Eventually, the absorption of the phosphorus also caused those jaws to take on an eerie glow. Now, the only known treatment was a really risky operation to remove the jawbone. So limes have many uses, but lime as a stone also does. Crushed and heated to about 800 degrees for several days, it would produce quicklime, used by tanners and dyers. Soaking quicklime in water created slacked lime, which was useful in mortar and whitewash. Besides the heat though, a lime burner's job was terrifyingly dangerous. Quicklime is caustic, highly unstable, and reacts violently to water. It can spit, steam, and even explode. It was so dangerous it was sometimes used as a weapon, thrown at an enemy to cause painful burning in the eyes, mouth, or anywhere it came into contact with sweat, which you're gonna sweat a lot doing this job. The word petard is derived from the French word meaning to fart, and petards were often bell-shaped metal devices filled with powder and fixed to a wooden base. The base was attached to the wall or gate of a besieged castle, and the explosion focused to cause maximum damage. So if you were a Petardier, you would operate these hugely dangerous and unstable devices, and they were kind of as likely to kill yourself as to damage the enemy's castle. The phrase hoisted by your own petard, meaning to be foiled by your own plan, comes from the prevalence of folks in this line of work being blown up by their own explosives. Not so fun. So before modern drainage, the bodily waste of increasing urban populations was a big problem. Back before we had plumbing, human waste was kind of collected by the local authority and put into cesspits, which were known as gongs. Now London, like many cities, provided houses of easement, or public toilets. But in the late 14th century, there were 16 for a population of about 30,000. Now germ theory might not have been around, but the smell certainly was. Enter the gong farmer. Only permitted to work at night, gong farmers, also called nightmen, were tasked with digging out and taking away all of the human waste that was piling up in these cesspits. They were also known as gong firmer, which sounds like a colorful bit of outdated slang that can make a comeback at any time. Paid per the ton, they spent all night in deep holes up to their waist or neck in human excrement. Some died of disease or suffocated. For those who lived, it was hardly a dream job. Presumably, they struggled to get a handshake, never mind a hug. Being a gong farmer was quite lucrative though, as after you've emptied the cesspit, you could then sell the waste on to farmers to use as a fertilizer, supplementing your wages. Farmers were prone to being attacked by gangsters actually, because it was actually well known that they were well paid. And they often had to go to the most crime-ridden parts of the cities at night, because, you know, we don't want to do this during the day. That would weird people out. They wouldn't like it, it'd be gross. So there's some professions out there that just kind of sound like a cosmic joke on some level. And being a leech collector, so being professionally bitten by leeches, is just so unrelatable to a modern person that it has something of that flavor. In the Middle Ages, medicine could barely be described as primitive, and methods such as fluid letting were common practice for a multitude of medical ailments. One method of doing so to a patient called for applying leeches, which had to be collected from nearby ponds and bogs. And leeches were a useful commodity, with both doctors and quacks using the gnarly little creatures to treat a number of different things. We're talking headaches, hysteria, everything in between. Before the invention of modern medicine, nearly everything was cured by just adding leeches to the affected area, hoping for the best. Now, to be fair, leeches do have natural anesthetics and anti-inflammatories in their saliva, so they would probably be pretty good at healing cuts that might otherwise get infected, but actively, letting out fluid isn't such a good idea. But pity the poor leech collector who had to use themselves as a human trap. The job usually fell to poor countrywomen, who would wade into dirty ponds in hope of attracting a host of them. Once the critters attached to the leech collector's legs, the individual would then prize them off and collect them in a box or pot. And this profession was particularly popular during UK summers, where the sogginess was kind of ideal for it. An account by George Walker from 1814 states that the profession was most commonly performed by Scottish women, by the way. Leeches can survive for up to a year with no food, so they could be stored at a pharmacy to be dished out as required. Now, unsurprisingly, leech collectors were in danger of suffering from excess fluid loss and infectious diseases, and actually kind of made themselves redundant because the kind of leech used in the field of medicine became extinct in the early 1900s. So Victorian London had a huge network of overworked sewers under the city, washing away the ickiness of the crowded metropolis. Toshers made their living down in the dark sewers, sifting through raw sewage to find any valuables that had fallen down the drain. And it was extremely dangerous work. Noxious fumes formed deadly pockets, the tunnels frequently crumbled, there were swarms of rats, and at any moment a tide of filthy water might wash you away. As a result of these dangers, folks in this profession generally worked in large groups, instantly recognizable in their canvas trousers, aprons with many large pockets, where they could stash their stuff, and lanterns strapped to their chests. Most folks also carried a long pole with a hoe at the end to investigate piles of human waste for dropped treasures, or with which to steady themselves if they stumbled. Now, after 1840, it became illegal to enter the sewers without permission, and rather than abandon the trade, Toshers began working late at night or early in the morning to avoid detection. And despite the stinking and dangerous conditions, it was a lucrative business for the working classes, with many a coin or silver spoon sloshing about in the muck. Now, today, people do something similar for fun, mudlarking, although there aren't sewers involved. Granted, if you go back a couple of decades, this would be a position that would be at the bottom of the economy, like the scavenging economy, that is. It would be somebody who walked in the riverbanks collecting bits of anything overlooked by other scavengers. These people toiled in extreme poverty, often barefoot, in the freezing water of the city's rivers. And you didn't know what you could find, maybe bits of metal, bone, or cloth that could be sold. But then you gotta deal with the, deadness, the excrement, and rotting fish. The practice of sin eating was most common in Wales and the Welsh border region of England, though there are similar traditions all across Europe. It usually involved eating a piece of bread placed on the chest of a recently deceased person. Gross, but not maybe the worst thing you've ever heard. However, in doing so, the sin eater took on the sins of the departed, and it eased the deceased soul, but some sin eaters risked arriving at the pearly gates of heaven, weighed down by the sins of hundreds of others. Now, being a sin eater often meant you were shunned in society, probably because of all the sins you had ingested, and the role was mostly taken by people who were desperate for money and food. It isn't that ancient a practice, however. Apparently the last known sin eater in Britain worked up until his death in 1906. During the Middle Ages, wool became the center of England's economy, and by the year 1300, there were probably 15 million sheep in England, outnumbering humans 1 to 3. So wool kind of needed to be cleaned after it was sheared off, and stripped of grease, which is where fullers came in. So wool is a naturally waterproof material, thanks to the oils distributed throughout it from a sheep's skin. Now, this grease was also what made the harvesting, carding, spinning, and weaving processes run pretty smoothly in the Middle Ages, but the cloth that resulted was kind of coarse, had a wide mesh, easily frayed. So the job of a wool fuller required marching on the spot in a vat all day, which was boring and tiring. But here's the thing, wait for it, the perfect liquid to remove dirt and grease and whiten the wool was stale human urine. So added into the trampling all day, your feet are soaked in cold, old, human fluid. Well, that was the cost of the finest cloth in Europe. And hey, if that wasn't bad enough, the urine used for this process came from multiple people, because you'd need a lot of gallons of this stuff. So fullers had to collect it from public toilets and private homes. Anybody else super grateful for modern chemistry all of a sudden? And finally for today, despite the clean sounding name, being a pure finder actually involved collecting dog feces from the streets of London to sell to tanners, who used it in the leather making process. Dog poop was known as pure because it was able to purify the leather and make it more flexible. Leather was in great demand in Victorian times, as it was used not only as tack for horses, but for shoes, boots, bags, and in bookbinding. Pure collectors haunted the streets where stray dogs were aplenty, scooping everything up and keeping it in a covered bucket before selling it to the tanners. Some collectors wore like a glove to protect their scooping hand, but it was just too hard, so a lot of folks were like, not worth it. And that's the end of our time once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.